series with MZN International, not-for-profit consultancy working in international development, key partner of Bond in terms of providing advice and support to our members. And really delighted to see Chris and Joseph here again. We're going to do presentations for about half an hour, and then there's an opportunity to ask questions. If you ask the questions in the Q&A box at the bottom rather than the chat, that's the best way to get your questions answered. But do park your questions as and when they arise during the session. The session itself will be recorded, and we'll send out the slides to all participants after the session is finished. So, a really interesting topic today. I think, at Bond itself, we're thinking about how the organisation needs to adapt, because it's definitely changed over the last 3 months. So a really fascinating subject for us all to engage with. So I'm going to hand over to Chris to take us through this, what should be a fascinating session. So over to you, Chris, and good to see you both.
Thanks, Mike. Good to see you. And I feel like you're slightly over-promising here. We're talking about restructuring and change. So not sure that that's that fascinating. Good morning, everybody. Nice that everybody's online again. I hope that we actually get to meet in person at some point when conferences and meetings and sessions and workshops continue, if they ever continue. We are talking today about how to change our organization in uncertain times and the dynamics of change. And Joseph and I would like to take a step back from the current crisis and just to take a look on how we actually change and shall we change the way we change in order to prepare not just for the next crisis, but for that recession, for different dissolutions, for Europe changing massively, etc., and for the second wave that my home country, Germany, is currently single-handedly producing. Right, we are Joseph and I are here. My colleagues Michael and Palu are actually working on restructuring projects and change projects with our consultants today, so I'm afraid you're stuck with us. And here is what we are trying to talk about briefly today. We want to briefly acknowledge that change is the new normal, why we change and how we change, that's the step back, and the particular look at the benefit of data. So continuously checking and actioning small incremental changes over this look and quickly fix. One of the changes that most of our organizations have been enforced to do is this remote working. And many are thinking now of changing that model. So we're going to take a single slide look at how remote is not distributed and how we need to get remote working much better. That's just one change to look into it. And then we have a few recommendations, and hopefully they are broad enough for everybody to find them interesting, but specific enough to find them actionable. Right, let's have a quick look in how change is the new normal. Now, first of all, let's have a quick look at why we want to change. The impetus for change can be obviously shocks like the pandemic. They are extremely severe, they are easy to spot, they are all over the place. What we need to do there is pretty obvious to everybody, and that we need to act as well. So the severity of change of the event is pretty high, and the ability to spot and the change need is also pretty high. Easy peasy, even though what to change is obviously a different question. And there are trends. Trends are the change in beneficiary trends, changing behavior trends, changing recruitment needs of employees, where they say we actually don't want to engage in this employment model. Large, medium to long-term trends that are still fairly openly discussed. They're still pretty severe in their impact on our operations, so they are fairly easy to spot. However, what change to result from that is less clear as well. We've got two more changes, however, that are far more enduring. There are mission requirements. Now, all of you work at mission-driven organizations, and the mission doesn't change so often. However, the requirements to implement that mission does. An example here would be, for example, that your efficiency needs to go up, or that your funding is changing, you need more or a different kind of funding, that your certain expenses that used to be optional and nice to have are now becoming essential. Zoom is an example, distributed work is another example. Your impact you need to generate may change in order to achieve your mission. What used to be based on in-person delivery, now you need to have far more digital skills and capacities that you needed latently before. Now you need them very much, or you don't need anymore. Do you really still need that big office? Question mark. That would be mission requirement change. Now they are less severe in their impact, they're less immediate, but they are very, very real. And finally, we got these environmental changes. They're a bit like the frog sitting in the warming water. Examples here would be new ways of working, structural sector changes, employee or partner habit changes, or your implementation chain is changing, your partners are graduating or finding it difficult in other areas. Here, the ability to spot the change need is much more obscure, much more difficult to see, and therefore the ability to lead and build a consensus for this change is more and more difficult for the leaders amongst you. So the idea that should be simple is you drive it. You're not driven by it. The change can be instigated across these 4 factors we just identified, but the most change is that we are undergoing is still reactionary. Look at Oxfam. Many of the changes being done there right now, which are very good and very comprehensive, but they may have been motivated, driven by shock events like Haiti, like Corona. So we are driven by this change. It's out of necessity, but not really the best way of doing it. And what we encourage here right today is the very obvious, but also a message that drive your own change. Or we'll give you a couple of pointers, or hope to give you a couple of pointers at least, of how to do this. We want to be in a position where the change that is designed is current, continuously improving to support the organization's strategy, which is also changing, of course. And that this is driven to the future, not just as a reaction to past events. That's the concept. I hope you agree. And here's a way to look at change. Now, one last look at change here. The way we change our organizations to adapt to these factors we've just identified can be summarized in this very crude and yes, qualitative graph here. Now, at the top of it sits this organizational restructure idea. You've all been part of it, I'm sure. Big organizational restructuring, usually going with cost optimization or critical investments or cutting even. They're quite disruptive. However, they do have the ability, if done right, to achieve change in a rather short amount of time. The problem is they very often fail in many respects. Other changes would be what we would call a functional reorganization. So this is not where we change the structure so much, but we are changing certain functions like a single department, or we are getting rid of certain functions or adding certain functions. A good example here would be the elevation of the Chief Information Officer to the board, where we say, okay, information and metrics are now becoming so important, we are raising this to the board. That is a functional change, a new department, or a new function in our organization in some way, shape, or form. That also can be done in a fairly reactionary way. Then there is this limited scope change. That is your step by step saying within this program, within this region, or within this corporate ability, we will change how we do things. Now, all of these 3 things are fairly rapid, and their need is often defined on the top. And I'm not sure about you, Joseph, but I always feel like these kind of needs are very much top-down driven. Whereas the 2 other ways tend to be a little bit more collaborative, a little bit more participative. And they are the organizational change development and the systematic check and action. Now, this is what we're going to talk about in a second, but the marked difference between this incremental change is that there is a culture of continuously asking the question, how could we do it better, and accepting that answer. But even the sheer act of developing metrics, of seeking out that data, of doing reviews and looking into areas that most people may think, oh, that's going well, that's going fine, no problem there, is a huge culture change. And then acting upon that as saying, okay, we've done okay here, but we can do better, or this is not going as well as it can do. We now have the data on a monthly or quarterly basis. We are now changing that capacity or the reducing it. That is a different way of managing. Joe, I can't remember what we actually agreed. Did you want to take this over, or was that me?
No, I'll pick up from here, Chris.
Oh, thank you. I wasn't.
Thanks very much for that. I mean, I think what Chris has highlighted there is that there are times where change is forced upon us, and we have to do something quickly, and we have to do something drastic. And unfortunately, there are not necessarily always ways out of that. So this is really looking at change, without that kind of shock, crisis-driven aspect. So it's really about how to build incrementally and slowly an organization that continually asks the question how it will be better the next day. And I think lots of our sort of interactions with partners, there's a quote there at the bottom of the slide sort of saying, actually, we know we need to do better, but we actually don't know how well we're doing today. So we need to start knowing more about how we're doing today before we can be better tomorrow. So the premise of that really is around understanding and building data analysis, analytics, and they can be so broad. We do them from finance, from HR, from operations, from communicate. You can turn any of those things into this sort of data process that allows you to really see those tiny incremental changes that Chris mentioned on the first graph. They happen. They're not necessarily severe. They're quite difficult to spot. But actually, if you are monitoring those, the data that you've set up on a daily, on a weekly, on a monthly basis, you can really start to see that change. And then you can act proactively to sort of move the organization to address that need. So it's really about building the metrics, building the system of analysis, being very open with the organization, with the whole infrastructure, and sort of saying, well, this is our new way of doing it. It's not about, sort of finding out what people are doing. It's about really understanding our organization and how it reacts to the environment. Part of that is encouraging accountable behavior. And it's really, it is a big mindset shift that we see in people sort of feeling that they're now under some sort of scrutiny in a very different way. And the way it's communicated is always important. And it's really about just giving people accountability, giving them opportunity to drive not only the data, but also the change themselves. And we'll pick up more of it on that in a moment. But the last point is really the critical point here, is that this process of continual change requires people to kind of come up with new ideas that are perhaps very specific to their own department, because that's the only department that's experiencing that kind of change. And it's really about giving them the feeling that you'll celebrate their opportunity, their chance, and perhaps their failure in enacting that change as an opportunity to learn as an organization. So Chris, if we could flick to the...
Yeah, can I just add something to that?
That you, please.
Yeah, sorry, this is a bit of a flow, or this is changing the presentation as we are doing it. We've done this webinar before, and lots of the questions that came out of it saying, okay, that sounds very good, I get the concept, but how do we do this? And I just want to mention two things. Critical to this one is one, cultural ability. This what Joseph just mentioned, is open communication. And let's stop being the cheerleader of the change and just look at the data. This accountable behavior, and spreading that. The other one is a technological driven tool. A lot of the metrics development, a lot of the data analysis is simply too expensive to do manually, and you want there to be a degree of automation. Now, this can happen with a simple online digital project management tool, that you can add for 10 quid a month, frankly. Or you can go as wide as a whole digitalization project incorporating, Microsoft Teams or Google Suites and driving data on the basis of that. It's usually a stepped process, and the metrics and the analysis you get from that changes as well. In all of the digitalization projects we are currently on, sort of hand-holding and being part of, what we usually start with one area of the organization. We design the metrics and the analysis that we think is useful, and after month 3 we realize, okay, that hasn't really changed, let's dial it down and change it to something else, and that evolves as well. So it's as simple as just getting started with producing more data and then analyzing it. Sorry, Joe, I didn't want to blow that. Before we move on, make it practical.
Great, thanks, Chris.
All right.
The next part of this, and this plays into the situation that we're in now. It's really that idea that work should be distributed, and there's a lot of sort of misconception around the idea that remote work, or us all working from home at the moment, or not needing an office space, is what agile looks like. Is what this new flexible work looks like, and I mean, in part, it is correct, but I think what we need to do is understand the organizational structure that underlies that. And it's really about having a traditional organizational structure with hierarchy, without autonomy, without, this ability to make decisions and to fail and to try things. We're just all sitting in our own homes, banging our heads against a brick wall. So it's really about this move to agile, and it's about thinking about how work is distributed. It needs to be distributed and asynchronous, not just remote, as in people sitting wherever they want doing the same old work. And it's about building those sort of skills and systems that promote and support that new function. And on the left of the right of the slide there, you have this kind of concentric circles that starts with the center, which is the self, and that's the autonomy that our team members, that our staff, that our colleagues have to work in a distributed fashion. And that means that they have clear parameters about how far they can go and what they can do and what they're able to do, but it's not the same as having the same organizational structure with a top-down management idea. So it's giving people autonomy to act and move and make decisions with authority and with the sense that that's what the organization has empowered them to do. It's then, from an organizational perspective, giving them mastery, or I mean, that's the term, but it's really about making sure that they have the skills, they have the mindset, saying, and they are empowered to make those decisions that we now want them to make as part of that distributed work system. And the sort of larger circle that's around that, which is actually ultimately very, very important, because if you're sending people off with great autonomy in this distributed working sense, you really need to have a very strong guiding purpose, guiding principle, be that the North Star goals, be that the organizational aims, objective, however it kind of is set. It really needs to be a kind of way of them to the light in which they guide their sort of autonomous distributed working practice. So those 3 circles, actually, if you take one of them away, you also end up with a sort of a little bit of a challenge in that you don't quite get the same traction from a sort of working perspective as you might do if you had the traditional organizational structure. Chris, do you want to make a comment on that one? I know that's your favorite.
You know me well.
Yeah.
Thank you. You're expecting the interruption. No, I just want to say, look, I spoke to Seppi 2 weeks ago, and I spoke to another organization just yesterday, and they couldn't be more remarkably different, even though they work both in the health sector strengthening. And I think Seppi there is pretty clear. They say, look, the old days will not come back. We'll have wave after wave. It takes a year, 2 years, 3 years, maybe even have a vaccine. By that stage, the next coronavirus is out. By that stage, the next recession is over. So they were pretty clear to stop trying to rebuild traditional organizational structures remotely. Like Reflect, to have your meeting that you would normally have in that meeting room. online. It's just a pain. And then the other organization that I spoke to just earlier this week is literally waiting for the old days to come back. On the old days, i.e. January. And I think we need to be pretty clear that that is not going to happen. Yeah, just want to support Joseph's message there. Let's start our acceleration to this distributed agile workspace a bit more. And I think, Joe, you're just about to give a pyramid how to measure your progress there, right?
Yes, hopefully. Let's have a look. It will appear slowly. There we are.
That was unnecessary.
I mean, this is really, I guess, either internal as an organization or perhaps as a kind of sector more widely, sort of demonstrating perhaps a journey in some senses, but also the acceptance that actually there are things, there are roles within an organization, there are organizations that perhaps to the greatest extent can't necessarily fully move towards this distributed agile way of working. So the bottom rung is really there is a job that can only be done on site. And I think the current situation has perhaps led us to question what those jobs are, but I believe that they're, they still exist very much. That the next kind of two rungs up are perhaps quite interesting because they perhaps represent certain parts of organization or certain parts of the core functions of an organization. Is that, perhaps we can't have a finance function that works in a very agile remote way because there are legal responsibilities, there are reporting responsibilities, all of these kind of things that work better if they're done by a fixed team on a fixed with a fixed schedule and a fixed basis. So it's really about saying, well, there are parts of organization, there are roles, there are functions that need to be core, that need to be continuous, that need to be guided by strong legal principles and not by this North Star agile approach. But looking at then the next kind of rungs up, and that's really about moving the organization from a traditional organization to a remote to a distributed organization. So at the moment, I think probably most of us or a lot of us fall into the category about most things are still synchronous. The work day is, okay, we're all not in the office anymore, but we have back-to-back Zoom calls that take all of our days, and suddenly at 5 o'clock, we've not done any work because we've spent all our times on calls. And it's really about, that's the traditional management structure. You're having meetings and I appreciate that you can't get rid of all of them. And some of them are necessary, but I think we've all learnt over this period that actually there are some that may be, perhaps would have been fine to have a 15-minute face-to-face, but once you've booked out a full hour Zoom call, it gives you a really different kind of look at whether that was a worthwhile use of time. So it's really about having that day that is continually interrupted, and it's based on this kind of 9 to 5 working day around a traditional management structure. Moving into the kind of start being remote, having a strategic focus, and then really at the point where you get this idea that you're working asynchronously, and that's working distributed, working around having your own autonomy to make decisions, not having to wait for approvals for certain things, and not having to sort of fit within that structure. And Chris and myself and our colleagues at MZN have a I'm not saying we've got to the top of this pyramid in terms of our approach, but we work with our own autonomy and our own authority, and we have touch points throughout the day. I mean, I'm usually based in Asia and Chris in Europe, and we've got colleagues in the US. So we have all time frames. So we have pre-agreed times that we touch base. So we make sure that things get done that need to be done and things are discussed that need to be discussed. But actually our working day is based around our ability to make the sort of decisions on behalf of clients or ourselves to really get that day kind of flowing. But, I appreciate that lots of the questions we have around that is that there are organizations, there are structures, and there are processes that don't fit into that. So we're talking about, an ideal in some senses, but I think within that there are sort of scope to move upwards on that pyramid to give everyone some of the benefits of having that sort of distributed work pattern. And I think, Chris, you're going to take it in from there, I think. You're on mute, Chris.
Oh, yeah. It's been 3 months, still haven't learned this. Working across this pyramid just helps me to think about what are the bottlenecks here. If something doesn't progress because some authority or authorization or approval is needed, and that's just a bottleneck. Typical example would be proposal submission deadlines and things like that. Then that's clearly not a distributed asynchronous way of working. And that's just ultimately doesn't give us the speed with which we need to be or agile to work in this environment. Good, so here are 5 tips, a bit more practical, of things we can do. Number 1, agree that change is constant and that you can't have one restructuring after the next restructuring and then the next restructuring. Restructuring in projects assumes that you get to some sort of happy place, some sort of, all right, once we've done this for 4, 6, 8, 10 months, then we are great. And that in 15 years, I've never seen this happening. There's a business model, an operating model goes out of fit, out of style, out of ability because of the trends we identified. So let's agree, change is constant. How do we build ourselves for change? Number 2, for those areas that are not compliance or risk management driven, create a vision and a roadmap. Give your organization the end state that you need. Picture a project manager in country X able to develop a program by herself with the help and support and the alignment you need. So define that end state and communicate that end state really, really well. There's lots of examples out there, happy to help as well. Number 3, in order to have metrics as an ongoing process and have it done without increasing the cost, it needs to be digital. So develop your metrics and then carry them into the computer, basically. Get people onto a common platform. Again, this needn't be expensive. There are plenty of platforms that work in all countries. They are getting good, and you can derive a lot of information and details out of that, and then set up like a quarterly or monthly report card. In fact, for some of our clients, we're doing this now as a standard thing, that the report card is like a monthly mini check that we are still performing as well as we can do. It's a bit like a coach in the gym, basically. Keep that communication efficient. Frustration will definitely rise because suddenly everything is online and metric and measured, and for example, the status of an internal development degrades after 30 days if no update is posted automatically. That means it turns red, the traffic light. That means the person is suddenly accountable not just to her boss, but the entire team or even the entire organization. So let's expect that. Let's keep efficient communication up. Let's get in front of it and say, yeah, this will be not just a change in systems and tools. This is actually a change of culture and behavior. But the benefit is clear because we will continuously evolve in this super fast changing environment. And number 5, what my colleague has just said, failing is good. You ought to fail. Let's make sure that we do not expect success from every initiative, from every project, from every lesson learned, from every M&E report. But let's say, okay, well, this didn't go well, and that's fine because here are the 5 things we've learned from that. Again, an online tool can help you then disseminate that and carry that message into the organization and beyond to your partners and donors as well. And that in turn reinforces the donor. Right. It's 11:32 in the UK now, 12:32 for me. We are bang on time. That is pretty much it. I think we've managed to mention a lot of concepts here. This is one more of a conceptual webinar. We have other ones which are more practical, but I hope you found this useful, and I'm really looking forward to some questions and some interaction now.
Thanks, Chris and Joseph. Yeah, maybe some of the questions could perhaps if you could in answering them think about how you make the give some sort of concrete substance to it. So Alison Marshall from Sensors just asked, can you say a few more words about asynchronous working and perhaps how you sort of go about putting something like that in place?
Yeah, I mean, there's actually not so massively difficult. You don't want to reinvent the wheel. So I'll just tell you one process we are doing with a client actually all over the world right now, headquartered on the East Coast of the US, is we are simply recommending and setting up an online project management tool. You all know the types of Asana or Trello or whatever else is there. And we are going from project manager to once carry their system, their project, whatever it is they're working on, onto the system. We're actually helping them do that. You can do that in an hour's Zoom chat. From there on, they develop the status of each initiative. That status will, as I just mentioned, degrade if no update is posted in a certain predefined time frame. That means you get an overview, a live overview of everything the organization is doing worldwide in any time zone at all times. And even though they are just indicators, you don't want that too much detail, otherwise the maintenance of the tool becomes a task in itself. It gives an unprecedented amount of information. And we've had some really good successes where a person in Bangladesh has said, "Hey, we happen to do a very similar project here in South Sudan." Oh, okay, well, let's see what things you use. And we had some really interesting results. For example, this organization just told me this morning before I came online, we never knew the breadth of the activity that is taking place. It makes this whole organization far more approachable and visible to me. So in terms of pragmatic terms, is as simple as launching an online project management tool.
Great, thank you. And I think this is one for Joseph really, but you touched on this a little bit, but maybe you could say a bit more, Joseph, about how do you balance the autonomy with the need for business delivery standards, compliance, risk management in a distributed system?
I mean, that is something that and actually it's usually the thing that I'm stuck with, because I work with the finances and the operations and the HR and lesser with the sort of the departments that can be agile and distributed. So I think that the critical thing is understanding how you can refine or develop those processes to be as efficient as they can be, and make sure that they are able to interact with the new remote distributed agile, whatever the sort of new model is. So it's really about preparing them to be integrated into an agile system, making sure that they're accessible, making sure that they're kind of clear, but as an organization, and there is often a sort of tendency of the people leading the change, or the people sort of instigating the change from the top, to think that the whole organization should be agile and should be distributed and should be remote. There is always a requirement for things that are better done by the same people, with the same sort of time frame on a kind of monthly or quarterly or whatever base it is, and finance and HR and those sorts of things tend to fall very much into that. So they're parts of the organization that we look at making more effective and more efficient, and making sure they integrate with a remote working practice. But those people are very much specialist, and there are sort of legal there are many obligations that they have that can't be completed, it can't be relied upon by people forming a squad to do the annual audit, and hoping that enough people join that could possibly do that work. So it's really about understanding what can be distributed and what should be just made more efficient and kept as a sort of core. We've heard it called, and we've termed it many things, but that kind of operational core, it's really a project of efficiency and integration rather than turning into something remote.
I've got a question which I'd like to just ask from a bond perspective about how you generate ideas and encourage creativity in a distributed organisation. So one of the things I was talking about with my colleagues yesterday was at Bond we have this room called the large room, and sometimes we go into the large room for a meeting, and then we don't end up discussing what the meeting was about, but actually we end up sort of discussing a whole load of other things that will actually produce some really interesting ideas that are generated almost accidentally, and we follow those up. We're finding it very difficult to replicate that space working from home, and I just wonder, have you got any ideas about how you create space for creativity? What you need, can you manufacture that again in this sort of home working world? Have you got any thoughts and ideas about how we do that?
Am I still on mute? No. Okay. Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Mike. Actually, idea progression is a key idea of a tool. And by the way, it is not just a digital workspace. It's really about how to use this. So idea progression usually goes through these 5-6 stages of ideation, development, assessment, sort of an M&E type action, and then amplifying the impact of it. And in the work digital dashboard that we are, for example, developing for that East Coast client I've just mentioned, we have a whole stream that is called idea progression, a whole milestones stream. And the idea is there's a form, you can send that form via WhatsApp, you can send a link via any medium that anybody uses in any country at any time to capture an idea. Then there's a process behind it where you assess that according to the strategy behind it, the North Star, and then it obtains team members or squad members. If a process or an idea has obtained enough interested people, and they're literally voting in a Facebook style fashion on the system, saying, yeah, that's a great idea, we want to progress this, then there is the initiator, if she or he agrees to be the idea progressor, or someone else, if not, has a duty to progress the idea. And that goes then through a funnel of saying, okay, we can only progress ideas that are aligned with our North Star or our values here, and there's a mini checklist here, and we can only at any point progress 3, 5, 10 ideas at a time, otherwise we have a bottleneck and there's too much going on. And then at every step between ideation, development, progression line, evaluation, and impact amplification is a scale, stop, and modify decision. Now that sounds very technical, but it's really actually easy, because every 3 months or at the end of every step, whichever is the sooner, you must make a management decision, either scaling, stopping, or modifying. And you can only modify a number of times, and that ensures that the idea is progressed. Once you modify it 20 times, okay, the idea was probably not good to start with. Does that help? That does help, and I think yes, I think sometimes we can get stuck in a sort of perpetual modification loop. That's right.
Where the same ideas keep we neither scale it nor stop it.
Yeah, right.
We're in perpetual modification mode and not really progressing at all.
Right. So in a client in Geneva right now, we've actually got this idea progression as part of a workspace where we said you can only modify an idea 4 times.
Right.
Then you either have to, the option literally goes away from the menu, and you don't need IT skills to build that.
Yeah.
Then you have to scale it, i.e. give it a budget, or it will stop.
Yeah. Very interesting. So just going to a question from Paul, have you got any good models for measuring the efficiency of system processes, preventing bottlenecks, I think, as well?
It's a huge question. And there are some good tools out there, and there are some out there. But let me just say, a single software or tool or subscription will not solve it. It's really about the culture. It's really about the change. But obviously, culture is partially follows structure. So once you set up a system, it will over time change the way we progress things as well. Now, in terms of metrics, there are the three good old ones, you know, time, budget, and performance. If something doesn't change in a certain amount of time, then clearly it's not progressing. So we've built in most of our dashboards a natural status degeneration from, if you imagine a status, well, it could be done, working on it, or I'm stuck. And if something is a done stage, the user needs to reaffirm the done stage in 15, 30, 60 days. Otherwise, it goes down. And then it goes on the dashboard, so it receives human attention. The other one is budget. Once you assign too much, that's what most have anyway. Once you assign too many costs to this particular cost line, then it's clearly exceeding. The other one is performance. Going down an objective key results channel, we have defined the key results that needs to be done for every objective. And if that key result isn't delivered, the objective can't be done. This is now, I would love to show you simply a system right now, frankly. But it stands and falls with you quantifying and qualifying what results you need to achieve in order to achieve whatever objective you're chasing.
Great, thank you. I had a couple of linked questions from Alison Marshall. Just in terms of, can you just sort of mention the names of the project management packages that you talked about? If you can share those, she'd like to look them up. But she's just asking a question really about if everyone, it's a very interesting question, if everyone has to use the same online project management tool and regularly update status, does this actually decrease autonomy? So are these project management tools actually restricting autonomy in some respect? It'd be good to get your thoughts on that, and just also reminders of the tools that you mentioned.
Yeah, so I'm not getting any commission. The reason we are not gold partner or associated with any of the project management tools is otherwise we might be seen as a little bit lenient towards one particular system. There's a huge amount of systems. Just to let you know, there's two types. There's digital workspaces. That would be your Microsoft Teams or your Google Business Suite. And then there is dashboards and metrics-driven project management spaces. They would, in the very simplest form, one well-known that I'm sure all of you know would be an Asana, a Trello, for example, a Monday.com tool, or a Jira or GitHub. And those systems often interlink to the digital workspace. There really are two separate things. So let's not confuse one with the other. I hope that, Alison, that helped a little bit and also answers Christina's Paradella answer there a little bit. In terms of autonomy, it's a really good question. I would really be careful not to increase approval requirements. The idea is I'm updating my colleagues around the world without the need for another Zoom meeting to dial in, without the need for another mass email. You know, I'm updating on my tool for my team locally on the project or around the world where we are at, what we're doing, which partner we are doing, and here's the status. And anybody who has an interest can take it. We are not asking for permission. And I think many transformation or digitalization projects have actually been misused as a power grab by powerful stakeholders within the organization to say, okay, this country can't submit this proposal without being approval from X headquarter over this amount. We can only hire this person once the regional office has approved, and they approve in a click here or an email there. Really important, autonomy is key. Let's trust our colleagues to hire who they want to hire, and that it's the right person.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to interpret this question from an anonymous attendee. I think it's really about, what you were talking before, Chris, about continuous restructuring, and the example of Oxfam, who's been undergoing continuous restructuring for quite a time now. Is there a different way that they might have handled that? And a bit more about. I mean, I think lots of organisations will be thinking about restructuring, and what would be your advice to them immediately about the sort of preventing this sort of ongoing restructuring, which seems to be the lot of many organisations, both in the international development sector, but also the charity sector generally as well.
Yeah, I'm going to go back in the slides here. Hopefully you can still see this. Look, by the way, first of all, Oxfam is an amazing organization. I for myself, on a personal way, I'm a huge Oxfam, Novib, Oxfam GB and Oxfam International fan. I am privileged and happy to have close association to the organization, and I think the transition process underway, this particular transition process underway, is bold and right. It's also been very externally motivated. So it's been very, Haiti, then Corona, then the funding challenge that came with it, then the public attention and the withdrawal of trust from the organization that it suffered. These were all external shocks that made it easy internally to rally around the need for change. So they are doing up. Mike, can you just confirm? Do you still see my slides?
Yes. Yeah.
My cursor as well?
Yes.
Cool. They are doing the stuff up here. They haven't done, in my personal estimation, enough of this down here. And the incremental change. Hindsight is a beautiful thing, but the question is, what mechanisms did Oxfam have pre the Haiti scandal to continuously ensure its safeguarding policy and its employee vetting services, and et cetera, et cetera? What safeguarding did we have to say, well, this is our reserve policy for a withdrawal of trust. This is how we deal with the pandemic. It's not about a risk register and then the what ifs conversation. It's about a continuous incremental change process. And it starts with data and metrics. It starts with exactly what Janet at CEPI said, and we put the quote in. It starts with knowing far more about us. And you as leaders in your organizations, you should be able to rally a coalition of the willing around the fact that, look, I don't want to change anything, but I want to know what's going on in the organization. I want to know our average proposal submission deadlines or timelines. I want to know our average time it takes to hire someone, not anecdotally, but hard data. I want to know how many staff work remote abroad, how much holiday we have. I want to know how many partners we have, what's our partner concentration. I want to know lots about our finance, and I want to know lots about how many projects move out of implementation phase into a follow-up phase. And all this data needs to be there to make decisions and incremental change. And that, I think, is not just Oxfam specific at all. That, I think, we are pretty bad at doing. And if we look at the private sector, those organizations that do well, just measured on stock market performance, for example, is pretty crude, but very objective at least. They tend to be the ones that elevate information to the boardroom. And they do that across the board. And that's no coincidence.
Yeah. I was interesting. That was just about to ask you that. I mean, because often the charity sector operations are compared unfavourably to private sector, and I'd be interested to. Yeah, I mean, do you think private sector organisations undergo this sort of perpetual restructuring that we see so often in our sector? Is that the norm or not?
Well, first of all, I'm not holding up the private sector as the be-all and end-all.
No.
Our view on the private sector is really, really warped. The social sector is far more in the public domain as the private sector compared to organization would be. I mean, when is the last time you heard something about a mid-sized 150 million turnover organization's internal project management? This doesn't make the news. Only the big DAX and FTSE companies make the news. And of course, they have more sophisticated systems. They also have billions and billions of dollars. So I think that comparison really is not helpful. But what is true, and researchers all around the world and are dedicating their lives to it, is that those organizations who invest more into information gathering and analysis tend to do better decisions over time. And for my 15 years in the sector right now, I don't know what you, Joe, maybe you can share that because you have a different experience, but when we go into organizations and they have a change need, what we hear a lot are anecdotes. When we ask even the simplest question in the first meeting or so, okay, what is the average onboarding time? Then the answer always starts with, well, I think, wait.
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo that, Chris. I mean, I spent 10 years working with sort of corporate banking. So I deal directly on behalf of a bank with finance directors of companies such medium and larger size, I appreciate, but occasionally similar in size to some of our partners. And, you know, the sort of, and it's partly due to the sort of amount they can invest in those systems, but it's also the fact that they see in huge value in having all of that data very, very much up to date and very, very much to hand. And often we'll go into a partner now, and it will take 3 or 4 weeks before we've got a kind of clear financial picture. Whereas often, and again, echoing Chris's point, I'm not holding the private sector up as the sort of the example we should follow, but within an hour's meeting, I would have the same information, and it's very much, and that kind of information tends to, that's reflected across lots of organizations. I appreciate that people on this call will be saying, hang on a second, I've got a handle on my finances. So I'm not really painting a broad brush. I'm using an anecdote, I suppose. But it's, that appears to be the sort of the sense that we get.
Brilliant. I think that's it in terms of questions. I think that was, I've got a question. May have another question. Just a second.
Yeah. Let's look at that.
Right. Okay, Kate. Restless Development is a medium-sized INGO. Like everyone, we continue to be hit with shocks and uncertainty. Frankly, we don't have the funds for an online project management tool anytime soon. Do you have any advice for interim steps we can take in the absence of immediate investment required to build that digital workspace, which would help progress the building of that autonomous culture?
Yeah.
Good question.
Yeah, no, it's a lovely question, and I really hear you here. Kate, very simply, let's forget the digital workspace. That is not a requirement. Let's define. My first step would be within Restless Development and anybody else in this situation, define what you don't know as much as you can. Obviously, you don't know what you don't know, but define what information are we actively missing, and then you can manually go about hunting for that information. Be that in the operational functions of Restless Development, i.e., HR, finance, program development, facilities management, whatever. That's easier. Or with a programmatic one, saying, okay, this is how much we do here and we do there. Low-hanging apples are usually finance, HR, and logistics, if you have them, because they produce a lot of data. So that's where I would kick it off with, particularly with finance, because there are some mandatory data you need to produce. Well, let's drill deeper into that down. And then the middle tier hanging apples you can manually get is things like time. How long does it take us to develop a proposal? How long does it take us to submit it and get an approval? What's the average here? Let's take 2019 as a step. Or away from the business development line, how long does it take us to develop a completely new program? Maybe you have staff in your organization where you can do not a quantitative, but a qualitative survey, saying, okay, I'm going to interview everybody with more than X number of years, say 5 years of service in Restless Development, and I'm going to ask you for your estimate independently of each other, and you can just use Google Forms. It's completely free, it's easy to set up. And I say, look, I'd like you to give me your personal estimate about how long it takes us to develop a new donor relationship or a new type of program or open a new office or whatever it is you want to measure. And then just get their number on it and force them to a number. You can just say, define, give me a number. I don't want an anecdote, I want the number. Your best estimate doesn't have to be correct. That will give you some insight. And then you can say, well, if it takes us, for example, 3 years to develop a new type of program, is that really fast enough for our beneficiaries? And I don't know much about REST development. You know this. If we know our beneficiaries and their needs are changing every 2 years, then a 3-year development process isn't fast enough, just as an example. So you don't need any technology for that, although it is quite labor intensive. And if you want to measure this one routinely and more objectively, increasingly objectively, then at some point a digital workspace solution is inevitable. But just to give you a cost implication, the cost of the subscription is really irrelevant. I mean, we're talking about $15 a month per person here. It's the cost of time and potentially externals to define those metrics, or you at least to use them, that will be the biggest cost driver here. I hope that helped. If not, get in touch.
Great. Thanks so much, Chris and Joseph. That was a really interesting session. Theoretical in lots of ways, but I think, it's very thought-provoking. And sort of that basic requirement of data as a sort of the underpinning structure of decision making is really really very interesting. So thanks, Chris and Joseph. You'll be back again for sessions next week, but thanks also for people taking part. I'm sure you're off to your next Zoom meeting without interruption. So really good to see everyone. If you have questions for Chris and Joseph or for Bond, just drop me a line and I can pass them through. Look forward to seeing you again soon. And thanks again to Chris and Joseph and to everyone who's taken part.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Bond colleagues, and hope to see you soon and all stay healthy.
Good.
Great. Thanks,
really,
everyone.
Really good session. Thank you.